Today on the Perception in Action podcast, what are the key differences between describing an athlete's movements, an athlete's knowledge about those movements, and the instructions used by a coach to facilitate the movements? How can these different perspectives inform and sometimes hurt each other? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to look at the critical differences between movement description, movement knowledge, and movement instruction, and talk about some studies that relate to this general topic. If you look around online or in coaching books, you will often see highly detailed post hoc descriptions of the things an athlete is doing while performing their skill. You will see things like references to some body part, for example, the front foot being open, another body part being braced, some other part being oriented at a particular angle, and so on and so forth. These might also even include some very crude calculations of the joint angles involved, which FYI are mostly useless because you can't accurately calculate angles from a 2D image in most cases due to parallax errors. The implication underlying these analyses is often, look at this, coaches, that's what your athlete should try to recreate to be successful. A key point, however, is that these detailed descriptions of movement, which are the purview of biomechanics and kinematics, do not tell us how an athlete should produce those movements, which is of course the purview of skill acquisition and coaching. Or stated another way, one addresses what athletes are supposed to do, while the other addresses how coaches help them to do it. I'm going to discuss a couple studies which show how biomechanical knowledge of movement can be useful in its instruction, but first I want to re-emphasize a caution about one way in which it can be harmful. What I'm referring to specifically here is using the same language to describe movements and to cue movements during instruction. On the one hand, when describing movement, we want to make highly detailed references to the performer's body. But on the other hand, when cueing movement, the 20 plus years of research on focus of attention suggests that we clearly do not. Let me give you an example of a recent study that put an interesting twist on this. In 2016, Cheryl Coker looked at cueing an athlete to execute a standing long jump. Her main interest was looking at the effect of the distance of the focus of attention on performance. As I've discussed in a few episodes now, previous research has shown that for skilled athletes, performance gets better when an external focus that is further from the body, that is, distal instead of proximal, is used. Gabby Wolf proposed that this occurs because directing attention to an intended effect of one's movement reduces conscious interference with execution and quote-unquote allows the motor system to more naturally self-organize. Coker was interested in whether or not there is a limit to this effect. In other words, if you keep moving the focus of attention further and further away, will performance keep getting better and better? In particular, she was interested in whether the distance that is actually attainable matters. So, for example, if you're instructing a golfer who is able to drive a ball 200 yards, will it matter if the focus of attention cue is at 150 yards, an attainable goal, or 250 yards, an unattainable one? I really like this twist because it effectively combines focus of attention research with the challenge point hypothesis, which suggests that motor learning is best when skill level and task difficulty are in appropriate balance. In her study, Coker asked 21 female hockey players to perform standing long jumps in 4 different conditions: a control condition with no focus of attention instructions, an internal focus of attention condition where they were told to, quote, focus on extending their knees as rapidly as possible, an external distal condition where they were told to jump as close as possible to a cone placed 3 meters away, which was a distance further than any of the participants could jump, and finally, the 4th condition was an external attainable condition, in which the cone was placed at the distance of that athlete's previous jump, and they were told to jump as far as possible past the cone. What was found? Jumping distance was significantly greater, by roughly 5 centimeters on average for the external attainable condition than for all other conditions. This suggests that having an external focus that is also at an appropriate level of challenge, that is pushing you to go a bit beyond your current ability, results in the best performance. There is, however, a slight confound in this study because of the instructions used. Specifically, there is also a directionality difference. For the external condition, the instruction jump as close as possible to the cone is a towards cue, while the cue used in the external attainable condition, jump past the cone, could be thought of as an away cue. As I discussed back in episode 78, this directionality does seem to matter. However, the predicted effect would be opposite to what Coker actually found. Towards cues are typically better than away cues, so it's doubtful this really had a large effect in her study. The effect of the attainability on the focus of attention is something I've actually been looking at myself recently. Specifically, in research on training batters to increase launch angle, I found that systematically moving a barrier to hit over further and further away based on performance resulted in the best learning. This was part of the presentation I gave at the recent Skill Acquisition Arizona meeting which I hosted. I will be posting a copy of my presentation soon. Circling back to the difference between movement instruction and description, in this study the internal focus of attention condition resulted in by far the worst performance, with jumps on average being nearly 10 centimeters shorter than in the external attainable condition. So while, quote, rapid extension of the knees may be a good description of what is going on during effective long jump, it is a terrible way to cue an athlete to achieve it. So, does this mean there's never a time when internal bodily focus descriptions, like those used in biomechanics, are useful for coaching an athlete? Well, I think the answer to this is yes and no. When referring to the cue a coach gives an athlete in the final few seconds before they are going to execute their skill, then I really do believe that internal cues should always be avoided. This is something I've changed my tune about over the years as I've done more and more research. Initially, I believed that an internal focus of attention would be effective for novices when first learning a skill, and would be effective for more skilled athletes when a technique change was required. And you'll see that in some of my writing. But more recently, I found that what actually seems to be the case is that an external proximal focus, not an internal focus, is what works best in most cases. So for example, instead of telling an athlete to drive off their back foot, which is an internal cue, it's much more effective to say push the ground back with as much force as possible, which is external and proximal, because it refers to the ground which is close to the athlete. And, as I stated a few moments ago, moving this focus further and further away as the athlete improves seems to also be effective. So, I think that for novices, we should be focusing on these external proximal cues, and also when rehabbing or working on technique change with more skilled athletes, this should involve moving external cues to more proximal locations instead of changing external cues to internal ones. But, having said all that, it does not mean that internal descriptions of movement are all bad, because optimizing skill execution should not be the only goal of practice. For example, I think it's also important for practice to include time for an athlete to develop bodily knowledge and awareness, which can benefit from a more internal focus. A good article on bodily knowledge of movement was recently published by Paraveen and Aroma earlier this year. In the article, they use a really beautiful definition I like. Quote, bodily knowledge is gained from the sensory information during the course of our bodily negotiations with the world, unquote. It involves becoming aware of the relationship between things like feelings of pressure and tension in our muscles and tendons and the associated body postures. So what we're talking about here is primarily using the senses of proprioception and kinesthesis, which I discussed back in episode 65. But an important difference here is that bodily knowledge in this context involves using the internal senses for patterns of movements that are related to the actual sport, not general abilities like being able to sense how much your knee or elbow is bent. A key point the authors also make in this article is that learning to perform a skill in the quote-unquote correct way does not guarantee that an athlete will form this bodily knowledge, and in fact it's likely they won't. Learning to perform a skill should involve a focus on external movement outcomes, as I've just been discussing, while developing bodily knowledge requires an attentive focus on internal bodily sensations. The authors further describe developing bodily knowledge as a process of bracketing motor skills, where an athlete reflects on the movement in action, with the focus being on the sensations associated with the movement itself, rather than the outcome the movement has on the outside world. This is also a skill that has to be developed in and of itself, as it typically takes novices some time to learn to tolerate and modulate bodily feelings and sensations so they can identify the quality of movements to notice some differences and similarities between them. So, skill and bodily knowledge development are obviously related. If an athlete has more bodily knowledge, they're likely to find more robust perceptual motor solutions for execution of a skill. However, the two things need to involve different conditions in practice. Developing bodily knowledge can be enhanced by using things like weighted implements or resistance bands in training. What the coach is doing here is exaggerating the sensation associated with different movements, but critically within the context of the movement that's actually going to be used in the sport, not some general PE drill. So the bottom line is that improving skill execution and improving bodily knowledge are important goals of practice, but they need to be trained at different times. A final point to note about bodily knowledge is that this is an aspect of training where we really need to watch out for the overuse of monitoring technologies. Giving an athlete constant extrinsic feedback about their movement will completely distract them from becoming attuned to their internal bodily sensations. In the final part of today's episode, I want to look at a couple studies which have examined coaches' knowledge of biomechanics and how movement description might be better incorporated into developing instructions for movement. Earlier this year, Mel and colleagues conducted semi-structured interviews to determine the extent of biomechanical knowledge for 10 ice hockey coaches. As further evidence of the distinction between movement description and instructions, the authors note that previous research has shown that, quote, coaches often use biomechanical concepts that are at best approximate and at worst completely wrong, even though they seem to be applied with relative efficiency on the field, end quote. So in other words, having an accurate description of movement is sometimes not necessary for coaches. I really like this ice skating study because the goal was bidirectional. That is, the authors sought to both evaluate the accuracy of expert coaches' knowledge and to use the knowledge that coaches do have to guide new ideas for research. So good coupling between empirical and experiential knowledge, which can benefit both coaches and researchers. In this study, the authors examined coaches' knowledge about forward skating kinematics. 10 French ice hockey coaches were interviewed with open-ended questions like, how would you describe a player who is skating? What was found? Without getting into all the specifics, coaches were found to have both practical knowledge that was consistent with movement science and biomechanics research, and also intuitions that were different from the research findings. An example of the former was coaches' detailed understanding of the skating cycles, alternation between support, propulsive, and swing phases, which have been found in research. This included both detailed bodily descriptions like full leg extension at push-off and the use of metaphors like duck feet. The biggest area of divergence between coaches' knowledge and research was the role of arm movements in skating. As it turns out, this is a fairly complex relationship, and the authors suggest that some of the coaches' observations are things that should be evaluated and clarified in future research. Another area that was identified was how handling a stick while skating changes kinematics. This is something that has not been studied much in research, so the authors cite this as an example which demonstrates how questioning coaches' practical knowledge can prompt the design of more representative research protocols. The results of this study actually agree with my personal experience, that highly skilled coaches, although they often use different terminology, have knowledge that is fairly consistent with what we know from kinematics and biomechanics. And where there is a discrepancy, it often points to something that should be on a to-do list for researchers. In this study, you can also see some good examples of how coaches convert description into instruction, for example via the use of analogies. The final study I want to mention today was conducted by Becker and Wu in 2015. In this paper, the authors use a biomechanical analysis of high jumping to develop effective cues. Specifically, cues focused on an athlete maintaining an upright posture at the point of the penultimate step, hips forward and shoulders back. Biomechanical analyses have revealed that if a jumper does not do this, it will be more difficult to achieve the desired posture during the final plant step. But of course, telling an athlete to thrust their hips forward and keep their shoulders back when they step are examples of internal cues. So how do we translate the biomechanical knowledge into an effective external cue? To explore this, the authors conducted a study with 4 elite female jumpers. To cue the athlete about posture, the experimenters placed a piece of tape on the jumper's shirt at about navel height and cued them to lead with the tape. What was found? In comparison to a control condition with no attention cues, the tape manipulation resulted in more upright posture and higher vertical velocity at takeoff. Okay, so what are the take-home messages from today's episode? Movement description, movement instruction, and movement knowledge are all very important elements of skill acquisition. They just need to be used and developed appropriately. Biomechanical and kinematic descriptions of movements are useful for evaluating athletes, but should not be used directly as tools for instruction. Instead, they should guide the development of external focus of attention cues that move from proximal to distal locations at a distance that hopefully challenges the athlete as the performer improves. Finally, bodily movement knowledge is a very important thing for an athlete to develop, but it needs to be cultured using separate practice time, where the focus is not on the outcomes of the movement, but rather experiencing the sensations associated with different sports-related movement patterns. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu, follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights, and find out more about the podcast at perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.
They said Jesus came, gone through St. Louis.